Officer Lisa Martinez had always been proud to serve her small, close-knit town. But tonight, Halloween night, something felt off. The station was quiet. Too quiet. The usual rustling of papers, the hum of conversation, even the buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed muted. Lisa sat at her desk, fingers drumming anxiously as she glanced at the clock. Midnight was minutes away, and an eerie fog had rolled into town, blanketing everything outside in an unnatural shroud. Her radio crackled, a static sound that made her jump. "Unit 12, report," the dispatcher's voice called. Lisa exhaled, relieved to hear something familiar. "Unit 12, all clear," she replied, trying to sound steady. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, and then a voice whispered through the static. It wasn't the dispatcher. It was deeper, rougher. "They're here." Lisa's heart thudded painfully. "Who's here?" she said into the radio, her voice barely more than a whisper. But only static responded, scratching at her nerves like fingernails down a chalkboard. The lights in the station flickered, casting brief, ominous shadows that stretched across the walls. Her reflection in the dark window was swallowed up by the shifting dark, and for a moment, she thought she saw another face beside her own. Sunken eyes, and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. She spun around, but the room was empty. Lisa stood frozen for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the station, trying to make sense of the shadows and reflections that seemed to move with a mind of their own. The eerie sensation of being watched crawled over her skin. The clock on the wall seemed to slow down, each tick stretching out like an eternity. She grabbed the radio again, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button. "Unit 12 to dispatch. Come in. Over." But there was no answer. The air grew colder, and a strange hum seemed to fill the room. Lisa felt the temperature drop sharply, and a chill ran through her spine. She stood up from her desk and walked toward the window, her eyes scanning the foggy streets outside. The town was eerily still. Not a single car passed by. Not a single person walked the streets. Her mind raced. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe stress was playing tricks on her, but deep down she knew something wasn't right. The radio crackled again, this time louder and more persistent. "Help us," the voice rasped, barely audible. Lisa's blood ran cold. It sounded like a whisper, but it carried an unmistakable edge of desperation. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the building, slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking toward her. Her breath quickened, and her hand shot out to the door, locking it with a loud click. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously moved toward the back hallway. Each step was accompanied by the faint echo of those footsteps, growing closer. As she turned the corner, her flashlight flickered once more, revealing an old photograph pinned to the wall. It was a picture of the police station, but the faces in the photo weren't familiar. These were officers long gone. Some of them she knew had passed away years ago. Her mind raced as she realized something was terribly wrong. The officers in the photo were still wearing their uniforms, but their expressions were frozen in terror, their eyes wide with fear. It was as if they were trapped in time, doomed to forever remain in that moment of horror. Suddenly a voice, low, gravelly, came from the darkened hall behind her. "We never left." Lisa spun around, shining her flashlight toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. A cold draft rushed past her, carrying with it a scent of decay. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she tried to steady her breath. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaky but trying to remain steady. "Show yourself." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the lights went out, plunging her into darkness. The only sound was the pounding of her heart and the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the station once more. Lisa's heart hammered in her chest as she fumbled for her flashlight, her hands slick with sweat. She found the beam of light and swung it around the room, but nothing moved. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The cold had intensified, and her breath fogged in the air. The air felt thick, charged with some kind of static energy. She needed to find out what was happening. She had to figure out who was behind these strange occurrences. Her feet moved, almost against her will, down the hallway toward the old evidence room. The hairs on her neck stood up as the temperature dropped further. She could hear her own breath echoing, loud in the silence. Her flashlight caught something in the corner of the hallway. Another photograph. This one was different. The photo depicted a man she didn't recognize, standing in front of the very same station. He wore an old-fashioned uniform, but his eyes were cold and lifeless, staring straight into the camera. She stopped in front of the photo, her fingers trembling as she reached out and touched the glass. As soon as her fingers made contact, the entire station seemed to shudder. A low, guttural moan seemed to vibrate through the walls. Without thinking, she grabbed the photograph and yanked it off the wall. Behind it, a hidden compartment was revealed, containing a small, dust-covered journal. The leather was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. Lisa's fingers hovered over it before she carefully opened it to the first page. It was a police log, dated October 31st, 1947. The entries were strange, cryptic, nothing like the usual reports. They spoke of disappearances, of officers hearing whispers, seeing things that weren't there. Then, in the final entry, one sentence stood out. "We've seen what's coming. We've become part of the station. The past never truly leaves." Her blood ran cold. The words seemed to resonate within her, as though they were warning her of something terrible that had already begun. The air felt suffocating, and Lisa's pulse quickened as she realized the full weight of the situation. The police officers who had worked here before had become part of the station, trapped within its walls by some malevolent force, unable to escape. She had to leave. She had to find a way out before she, too, became a part of the station's haunted history. But as she turned to head back toward the exit, she froze. The hallway was no longer the same. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, and the floorboards creaked as though they were centuries old. The lights flickered once more, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift. Then she heard it again. The footsteps. Closer now, echoing louder, as if someone, or something, was walking right behind her. She spun around, her flashlight scanning the hall, but there was no one there. The cold was unbearable, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. She stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. From the darkness ahead of her, a low, raspy voice echoed, "You shouldn't have come." Lisa gasped, her breath freezing in her chest as the voice grew louder. "Leave now, or you'll join us." The wall seemed to close in on her as the very air began to twist, and her vision blurred. She wasn't sure if she was still in the present, or if she had been transported back in time. All she knew was that the station had come alive, and it was hungry for new souls. The room seemed to close in around Lisa as her flashlight flickered once again. She tried to move, but her feet felt as though they were stuck to the floor, as if some invisible force was holding her in place. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, drowning out all other sound. The shadows stretched, and the temperature dropped until it felt as though she were walking through ice. Her mind raced as she thought of the journal. The officers had warned her. She wasn't supposed to be here. This place, the station itself, was a prison for souls long lost to time. The longer she stayed, the harder it would be to escape. And then she heard the voices, whispering, muttering, like a chorus of the damned. "We've been waiting for you," they crooned in unison. Suddenly the lights flared to life, blinding her for a moment. And when her vision cleared, she found herself standing in the middle of the station's main room. The walls were no longer just walls, they were alive. Faces were pressed against the glass, twisted in agony, their mouths opening in silent screams. Lisa stumbled back, realizing with a sickening jolt that the figures in the walls were the officers from the photographs, the ones who had disappeared years ago. They were trapped, their souls forever bound to this place. The door slammed shut, and she knew. She was trapped. The days blurred together as Lisa's mind struggled to grasp the truth. She had become part of the station, just as the officers before her had. She wandered through the halls, seeing their faces, those trapped souls, forever etched into the walls. She knew there was no escaping now. The station had claimed her, and it would claim more. Every Halloween, new souls were drawn to the cursed building, lured in by its whispers. The station's hunger was insatiable, and Lisa would be its newest resident, forever bound to its haunted halls, unable to escape. Trucker. Jake Evans was known for his night drives. The solitude of long stretches of empty roads and the hum of the engine brought him peace. But even he couldn't deny the feeling of dread that crept over him as he traversed the most deserted part of Route 66 on Halloween night. The moon cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the distance. Jake had taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. A chill settled in the cab, making him shiver despite the heater running on high. The road was empty, as far as he could see, with no sign of life except for the skeletal branches of trees that lined the highway. He glanced at the time, 12:15 a.m. It was the witching hour, and an unsettling silence blanketed everything. A sudden flicker of movement caught his eye. Up ahead, illuminated by the truck's high beams, was a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a man hunched over with his back to the approaching vehicle, wearing a tattered coat that flapped in the wind. Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Picking up strangers was something he never did, especially not on nights like this. But as he got closer, the figure didn't move. It stood frozen, head down, arms hanging limply by its sides. When Jake passed, he could swear he saw the man's head snap up and turn to follow him, eyes glowing a faint, unnatural red. "Just your imagination, Jake," he muttered, trying to steady his breathing. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting the man to be gone, a trick of his tired mind. But he was still there, standing in the middle of the road, watching as Jake's truck sped away. Jake's heart thudded against his ribcage as he pressed harder on the accelerator. The thrum of the engine filled the cab, but it did little to drown out the growing sense of unease. He glanced back at the road, illuminated by the glow of his red taillights. The figure was gone. Relief washed over him, only to be replaced by cold dread as he noticed something else. A shape, darting between the trees, keeping pace with the truck. "No way," Jake whispered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wheel. The figure flitted from shadow to shadow, moving impossibly fast, its silhouette distorted and elongated by the moonlight. It moved with an inhuman grace, more like a predator than a man. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, static hissing and popping. Then, a voice cut through the noise, low and guttural. "You can't outrun what's already here." Jake's blood ran cold. He twisted the knob, trying to turn off the radio, but it continued speaking, a language he couldn't understand, laced with a dark, rhythmic chanting. The truck shuddered as if responding to the voice, and the headlights flickered, casting erratic beams that distorted the road ahead. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a vacuum of silence that was more terrifying than the sound itself. Jake dared to glance at the passenger seat and nearly swerved off the road. Sitting there was the man, or what remained of him, skin pale and eyes sunken, yet with that same unnatural glow. A crooked smile spread across his lips as he turned his head toward Jake. Jake slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding and groaning as it came to a halt. The figure vanished, leaving behind only the echoes of Jake's ragged breathing and the whine of the engine. The cab was empty, but the seat was ice cold, and a faint trace of the metallic scent of blood hung in the air. His heart pounded as he scanned the dark forest surrounding him. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting and writhing. He thought he saw faces in the trees, hollow-eyed and grinning, but they disappeared when he blinked. Jake's fingers trembled as he reached for the radio, hoping for a reassuring voice, perhaps another trucker who could tell him he wasn't alone. Instead, a soft chuckle came through the speakers, followed by the same voice now dripping with menace. "Too late, Jake. The cab door slammed shut without warning, and Jake yelped. The truck rocked as if something enormous had landed on the roof. Scratches and thuds came from above, and the roof began to dent inward. Jake's survival instincts kicked in. He floored the gas, the truck lurching forward with a roar, the force throwing him back in his seat. As the truck raced down the highway, the thudding on the roof stopped, replaced by a deep, vibrating growl that seemed to come from inside the engine itself. The speedometer needle jumped erratically, and Jake felt control slipping away. Suddenly, the dashboard lights flared and dimmed, and the growl turned into a low, guttural laugh. Jake's eyes darted around the cab as the laughter echoed, resonating deep in his bones. The truck felt alive, possessed, the steering wheel resisting his grip as if fighting him. His breath came in short gasps, the cold seeping into his chest, numbing his fingers. The road ahead twisted, a sharp turn looming out of nowhere. With all his strength, Jake wrestled the wheel, managing to keep the truck from careening off the edge and into the dark forest below. The laughter subsided, leaving only the pounding of blood in his ears and the rasp of his breathing. A brief, fragile silence settled over him. The headlights illuminated the road, which was now surrounded by mist that licked the ground like pale tongues. But then, something shifted in the fog. A shape emerged, standing dead center on the road, forcing Jake to slam the brakes once again. The truck skidded, tires screaming, and came to a grinding halt just feet away from the apparition. This time, Jake could see him clearly, the man from the roadside. His eyes glowed an impossible crimson, his mouth stretching into a smile too wide for a human face. He raised one hand, pointing directly at Jake as though calling out an execution order. Jake's heart seized. He reached for the glove compartment, fumbling for the small revolver he kept for emergencies. His fingers closed around the cold metal, and he looked up, weapon raised. But the figure was gone, replaced by an empty road, and silence so deep it buzzed in his ears. The truck's engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out. Darkness swallowed everything. Sweat dripped down Jake's forehead as he tried the ignition, but the truck refused to start. His pulse raced, pounding in his chest like a war drum. Outside, the mist thickened, curling around the truck like an embrace. He could swear he saw shifting shapes within it, faces leering, whispering, beckoning. Suddenly, the radio came alive again, this time with an old, crackling country tune warped and slow. A voice hummed along, deep and unnatural, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Jake's hands shook as he banged the steering wheel, trying to snap himself out of the nightmare. "Help me! Someone, please!" His voice was raw, but the mist only thickened, muffling everything. The whispering grew louder, almost playful, as if it mocked his fear. Jake felt the cold slide of panic settle into his gut when a knock tapped against the driver's side window. He turned, the coldest shiver running down his spine. The man was there again, only inches from the glass, eyes still glowing. This time he spoke, though his lips barely moved. "The road remembers, Jake. It always does." A rush of adrenaline surged through Jake. He wasn't going to sit and wait for whatever fate this was to claim him. With a trembling hand, he turned the key one last time, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. The truck's lights blinked on, casting away some of the mist and momentarily dispelling the figure outside. Jake didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and took off, tires spinning and smoking on the damp road. The fog thinned as he gained speed, the laughter and voices fading behind him. The road seemed to stretch out endlessly, but he pushed forward, refusing to look back. Hours later, the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, painting the sky with pale light. The whispers were gone, the shadows banished, and Jake's grip on the wheel finally relaxed. The horror that had gripped him loosened just enough for him to catch his breath. But as he reached a rest stop, exhausted and shaking, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. In the reflection, just beyond the trees, a pair of crimson eyes glowed before disappearing into the morning light. It was a quiet night on the force. Officer James Miller had just finished his shift when dispatch called him about a possible break-in at an old, abandoned motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't unusual for these kinds of calls to come through in the dead of night. People often mistook the creaks and groans of old buildings for something more sinister. But there was something off about this particular call. The dispatcher's voice sounded distant, almost as if they were speaking from a faraway place, and there was a faint static crackle in the background. "Officer Miller," the dispatcher said, "we've had a report of movement inside the old motel on Route 47. The building's been abandoned for years, there's no power, and the place is falling apart. Be careful." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had driven by the motel countless times, never giving it much thought. It had been shut down after a series of mysterious disappearances that had occurred years ago. The building was nothing but a dilapidated shell, its broken windows and rotting walls a stark reminder of the past. No one in town talked about it anymore. Until now. James turned on his siren and sped toward the motel. He kept his hand on his gun, feeling an uneasy tension settle over him. As he drove through the empty streets, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. The closer he got to the motel, the more oppressive the air seemed, as though something dark and malevolent was lurking just out of sight. He reached the old motel and parked his squad car near the entrance. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound being the wind rustling through the dead leaves scattered across the parking lot. James grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the front door. The building looked even worse up close. The front door was hanging off its hinges and broken windows revealed the dark, empty interior. The flickering light from his flashlight cast long, wavering shadows across the walls, making the place seem even more foreboding. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. The musty, damp scent of mold and decay. The air inside the motel was thick and stagnant, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence. He shone his flashlight around, trying to get a sense of the building's layout. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors, each one as dark and empty as the last. "Hello?" James called out, his voice sounding strangely loud in the oppressive quiet. There was no answer, just the soft rustling of wind outside and the distant drip of water somewhere in the building. As he walked deeper into the motel, he noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, leading to one of the rooms. The prints were large, almost as if someone had been walking barefoot, their feet leaving an impression in the dirt. James felt a knot form in his stomach as he followed the tracks. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and the deeper he went, the more the air felt heavier, as though the building itself was alive, breathing with an ancient, malevolent energy. His flashlight flickered once, then steadied, casting a shaky beam of light ahead. He reached the door the footprints led to. It was slightly ajar, and he could feel a cold breeze coming from within. James reached for his radio, but before he could speak, a strange noise echoed from the room, a low, guttural sound, like something growling in the darkness. He hesitated, his hand hovering over his gun. He pushed the door open with a creak and the room came into view. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. The room was not empty. There, in the center of the room, was a man, his back to James sitting on the floor, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He was covered in dirt and grime, his clothes torn and stained. His hair was matted with sweat, and his skin was pale, almost sickly. But it wasn't the man's appearance that disturbed James. It was the way he was sitting. The man's head turned slowly, so slowly, as if it had taken him a great deal of effort. His eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto James with a look of pure terror. The room felt colder. Without a word, the man stood up, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He took a slow, deliberate step toward James, his gaze fixed and unrelenting. James backed up instinctively, his hand going to his holster as the man advanced. But before he could draw his weapon, the man collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing violently. "Please," the man gasped, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You need to get out of here. You don't know what's inside this place." James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man struggled to push himself up, his hands shaking. "The motel? It's not just a building, it's a trap. It's alive." James watched in disbelief as the man fell silent, his body trembling with exhaustion. He took a few cautious steps forward, his flashlight illuminating the man's face. The terror in the man's eyes was unmistakable, and for the first time in his career, James felt a deep, visceral fear. "Tell me what happened," James urged, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at him. The man swallowed hard, his voice shaking. I used to be a guest here. It wasn't always like this. This place was once a nice motel, a safe place for travelers. But something happened. Something bad. It started with the disappearances, people checking in but never checking out. The workers here, they were the first to go. Then the guests. It wasn't long before the entire town stopped coming here. The man looked around nervously as if expecting something to jump out at him. He continued, his voice low and urgent. "One night, I stayed here. I was just passing through, but that night was different. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear whispers, voices in the walls and the floors, in the air. I tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. And then it happened. Something dragged me back into this room." James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The man's story matched the reports of strange occurrences from the town's history, but hearing it from someone who had actually experienced it made it far more real. "The motel, it feeds on fear," the man whispered, "and it never lets you go." The man's eyes glazed over, and he began to shake uncontrollably. The room grew colder still, the walls seeming to close in around them. "Please," the man begged, "you have to leave, before it comes for you too." Before James could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls groaned, and the ceiling above cracked, sending dust and debris falling onto the floor. A horrible, screeching noise echoed through the building, and the very air seemed to warp with malevolent energy. And then, everything went dark. James regained consciousness a few minutes later, his head pounding. The room was silent, the oppressive weight of fear still heavy in the air. He sat up slowly, his hands trembling as he looked around. The man was gone. The motel, too, seemed to have changed. The familiar smell of mold and rot had been replaced by a sickeningly sweet, putrid stench. He got to his feet and staggered toward the door, but it was no longer the door he had entered through. The hallway outside was dark and unfamiliar, twisted into something alien. The doors were all closed tight, and the once familiar sounds of the building were now replaced with distant, echoing whispers. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. He banged on it with all his strength, but it was as if the building itself was alive, pushing back against him. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. James's breath quickened as the walls around him seemed to shift and sway. He turned in every direction, but nothing was familiar. The hallway seemed to stretch out infinitely, its end swallowed by darkness. His heart raced. He had to get out. James ran through the halls, calling out, but his voice echoed back at him, swallowed by the strange energy that filled the building. The walls seemed to close in, pushing him toward the center of the motel. He was trapped. There was no way out. And then he saw it. A door at the far end of the hallway standing open. With every ounce of energy he had left, James ran toward it. As he neared the door, he felt the temperature drop even further, the air growing thick and suffocating. But he didn't care. He had to get out. He reached the door, stepping into the light beyond. The instant his foot crossed the threshold, everything stopped. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air was suddenly clear. He was outside the motel, standing in the empty parking lot. The door behind him slammed shut and the building fell silent once more. James looked around. The night was calm. The motel, now just an abandoned ruin in the distance, was silent and still. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But James knew better. The motel was still there, waiting, and it was hungry.